All right. Well, I appreciate everybody being here, and yeah, I'm really excited to about this. I wish I could be there in person. It sounds like y'all are having a big time. A lot of folks having time there. Wish I could be there with you. But the last time that I spoke with this group, I talked about burning in Upland Hardwoods, and based on that experience and working with quite a few landowners across the Appalachians and Central Hardwoods and with many professionals across those regions, it became apparent to me that we still have a barrier to using fire in upland hardwood systems, and that kind of me down a path to try to address that barrier, and that's what I want to talk to you today about. The main barrier that has been communicated to me is that there are associated risks, especially for private landowners. It seems to be a concern with damaging timber and merchantable timber, in particular oaks, and they're afraid to take that risk to get the gains that they may get from burning. So that's kind of where this talk came from. And originally, I, I published an article with the National Deer Association in their magazine on this topic and got great feedback. And I think that probably led to the invite to come talk to you today about it. So, uh, I have been throughout the region and seen quite a few stands that look like this. And I think it's important for us to think about. I know you've already had some great presentations that have talked about the potential benefits of prescribed burning. So I'm going to touch on a few of those and not belabor them in this presentation. So, but I also think it's important to build up to the main topic of today, which is really about the risks and whether or not it's worth it for you to take that risk. So in a stand like this, I think it's important first to think about what is limiting the understory structure, which is what many of our wildlife species and the ones that I really focus on and love, deer and turkey, are being limited by. So in this forest setting, light is the limiting factor first. So that requires you to take some action to release light before you can gain many of the benefits of fire. And you've probably already seen a variety of presentations presenting on things that change when you release light and then add fire. So obviously, a timber harvest, partial removal of the canopy through that is desirable if it's possible. But I've also worked with quite a few landowners in many contexts where they don't have that option. So what do you do in that situation? And I've worked with Craig Harper and Mark Turner, who have given presentations here about this, and worked in my own lab on another approach if you don't have that commercial opportunity, and that basically be forest stand improvement practices, where you go in and inject trees that you don't want in an effort to release sunlight through the canopy. So I'm going to talk about this practice along with a similar merchantable harvest, a shelter wood technique, in a few minutes, but I just wanted to introduce this to you. This is really an effective tool to have at your disposal if you're in a situation where you can't harvest timber for some reason. So the goal in this situation really is to release at least 30% sunlight. And what we're trying to do is release light so that we can gain the benefits at the understory level, like increasing nesting cover or soft mass production or forage quality in production for deer, variety of other things for various wildlife species. That's the principal reason that we are trying to release sunlight. With forest stand improvement, and in some cases even with commercial harvest, you could also really benefit hard mass production if you're selective during that process and release the trees that are most productive. So this is showing you what I mean in the understory. So we've released sunlight here. This stand has since received fires. This was actually a forest stand improvement where we removed about 40% of the overstory, and you can see the structure is quite developed in this understory and really excellent in this condition for nesting or for fawning for deer. Really what we're trying to accomplish with that is sort of this woodland structure where we have sunlight penetration that might vary substantially across the stand. As you can see in this, you might have a variable retention of canopy. So we have some places that may be a little more shaded, other places that have full sunlight, and all in between, with the average across the stand being 30 or more percent open. And in that condition, we can generate really exceptional ground cover for a wide range of species, including deer and turkey that I often focus on. And when you are planning this out, if you're also targeting south-facing slopes that tend to be drier and are using low-intensity fire, you can perpetuate these kinds of conditions long into the future. So I wanted to give you some specifics on a couple of species. So wild turkeys, there has been concern over wild turkey populations, especially across the range of easterns. And we know that populations have relatively low productivity, and some of these practices can greatly enhance productivity. So I wanted to talk about that a little bit. One thing, I think you probably saw it in Mark Turner's presentation, visibility and how prescribed fire affects visibility greatly affects habitat use by wild turkeys. So keep that in mind. We're trying to generate a developed understory structure, kind of like this picture we see here, where a hen can see over that structure and use it safely, but also we have that developed herbaceous plant community for her to use it. So if we use dormant season fire, that consumes the litter, it also exposes seed, also can enhance structure, the diversity of herbaceous plants available, and overall benefit wild turkeys for nesting. Also, you remember the picture I showed you, once we start to have some of the shrubby encroachment, the hens will use it for nesting, but it also provides pretty exceptional fawning cover in that same circumstance. In that case, we're looking to use fire at a bit longer interval than if we had other objectives. So depending on where you're at, probably in more northern reaches where most of you are probably working, we're going to be on the longer part of this interval, so maybe 5 to 7 years if you're trying to provide high quality nesting and fawning cover, whereas in hardwood stands down where I'm at, we might still be using a 2-year return interval to target those objectives. But for brooding cover, in that situation, we really want a developed understory of herbaceous plants dominating that with an openness at the ground level so that poults can navigate under that canopy of forbs and grasses in that community. So that's a faster return interval. And I just wanted to kind of touch on this, that depending on what your objectives, and especially if you have many objectives, it might behoove you to vary the fire return interval, even if you're managing for a single species across stands. Also, something that I've been working on, and I know you've already seen a presentation about late growing season fire. This has traditionally been the most underutilized part of the burn window, and we have great data now that's been published to show that we don't pull permits in the late growing season very often, even though we have a lot of great burn days in much of the east. So there can be benefits, and in upland hardwoods, one of the benefits we see is this low intensity fire progression in that fuel type tends to increase variability in the understory structure. We also tend to see an increase in forb coverage, and farther south, when I've done work like this in pines, but when we maintain a relatively high fire intensity within those fuel types, we see better hardwood control and also substantial increases in forb coverage. So that may apply if you're in situations where you have a really flammable fuel type that still carries fire really well at that time of the year. So when we're talking about burning upland hardwoods, I am talking specifically about using low intensity fire to do that. And that's what I'm kind of showing you in this picture. This fire was set in February, and you can see a very low flame height and slow fire progression backing through this stand. And that's the kind of fire we're trying to use. Obviously, that takes a long time to do it, but you can do this really effectively with not much risk and still realize many of the benefits of fire in that situation. This is that same stand showing you the response in vegetation, pretty substantial. Notice we have a little lower penetration from the aspect penetration areas in the stand, and that variation in structure is really excellent for providing brooding cover, but also patches of it within it are providing really excellent nesting cover. So you can see this stand has been burned repeatedly over 16 years. Here's another example showing that same low intensity fire backing through this stand. This is a little later. So a drawback of burning later like this is there's less time for the vegetation to respond. And while we do have bare ground in this stand, it doesn't have the canopy yet that would support really high quality brooding cover. However, we do see very high forage quality, and I'm going to get to that. I'm going to switch to deer in a few minutes and talk about that. But we do see trade-offs based on the timing, and I'll get more into that here in a few minutes. So just in general, you remember I talked about light limiting responses in the understory. Well, that's what you can see here with fruit response, and this is generally a valuable resource for a wide range of wildlife species. When we open the canopy, we have a substantial increase in fruit production in the understory. When you add fire without doing that, there's no change. If you do both together, fire augments the effect of canopy reduction, and it can maintain that high fruit production for a long duration, as long as you have sunlight released to generate adequate response. Same principles apply to ground cover. And you can see the ground cover is relatively low in closed canopy conditions usually, and adding fire does not change that. However, when you release light, you see a substantial increase in ground cover, and when you add fire in the mix, they augment one another. Here's another example. I love this picture because it really shows you some of the food resources that are being released. This one specifically for turkeys, but showed you a few minutes ago that all those resprouting plants in that previous photo also do the same thing for deer. So you can see there are exposed acorns, snails, and all kinds of bugs in these stands. And here I took a picture actually on the way to the stand showing you turkeys that were attracted to it. So I wanted to show you a visual representation. This is actually generated from a pine system, but the same applies to hardwoods. This is turkey habitat use, and you can see on the right side of the image is showing you in them, and the turkey habitat use is really strongly focused on stands that have sunlight penetration and are also being burned. Fire is causing a magnet effect on the use by turkeys. In this same study, we did the same thing with deer, and I don't even need to change the image to show you deer use because they look almost identical. Fire is causing a magnet effect, and that's partially due to the release of these resources being made available that are really attractive to those species. Here's showing you that data for deer. So on the x-axis, you're looking at the month of measurement of forage quality, and the color of the bars represent when the fire was applied. And this is farther south. You can probably adjust this a little bit. Maybe the April fire would cause this enormous pulse in quality where you're at compared to June where I'm at. But the point of this is the forage quality, so the proportion of the plants that are selected by deer that are resprouting for a short duration after the fire is exceptionally high. And that generates that magnet effect that we're talking about. It probably will last even longer in your part of the world than it does for me. You can see it dissipates pretty quickly after fire in this system, but the point is it generates that really high quality forage right after fire that's super attractive. In this study, I'm showing you a very similar idea. The top graph is actually showing you when permits are pulled and prescribed fires are actually applied in the eastern United States. And you can see those are primarily centered on dormant season. In upland hardwood closed canopy conditions, it may not even be possible for you to burn it. The fuels literally may not even carry fire during that midsummer, but in pine systems, we certainly can do it there. And you can see lightning in particularly pine systems is generating fire primarily in that time. So that gave me a really interesting idea that I wanted to say, well, what happens to forage quality if you change the timing of fire during that burn window? So if you look at the bottom four graphs, I'm showing you what happens, and the horizontal blue line is showing you how much phosphorus is needed in a plant for a female deer to meet lactation requirements, which are really high. The white bars show you what the average quality was in this system. And then as you progress across the right through those graphs, you can see when you apply fire in February or April, how that affects that forage quality during lactation versus in this system, this was also a southern system, when we applied it in June, that resource pulse all of a sudden made the average plants in the community high enough quality for her to maximize lactation. So timing can matter substantially because of this effect, but in general, the application of fire when you have adequate sunlight is going to substantially increase forage production for deer. Another thing that I found really interesting, and this study was done in Mississippi, we applied fire at different times of the year and looked at how it affected diet selection within the stands for deer. And you can see Smilax and Rubus, those are kind of golden standards. They're very high quality, pretty much under any circumstance for deer. We see high selection of those plants, regardless of whether they've been burned. And then the tall gray bars, we were burning during the growing season, and you can see when we applied fire at that time of year, it actually shifted the quality of maples and hickories and other mesophytic species that are undesirable generally in those stands. It shifted diet selection of deer to focus on those such that they were perceived by the deer as equal quality to the bread and butter plants, the greenbrier and blackberry in those stands, which I thought was pretty interesting and could be really useful, especially if you're in a situation where browsing is causing problems for, let's say, oak regeneration. So this is from Eastern Tennessee and Upland Hardwoods. This was part of my master's work, and I wanted to show you what I was talking about with the forage biomass, and it's going to become important because I used this to try to quantify what the risks are in terms of cost per gain. So the shelter wood and fire, that's the SW and the RC means retention cut. So that's that forest stand improvement practice. And if you average those, when we have adequate sunlight and add fire, we are looking at about 650 pounds per acre gain from doing that. So that's going to become important in a few minutes. I just wanted to point that out. All right, so let's switch gears a little bit. Let's talk about the risks of burning in hardwoods. So in most cases, when we're promoting that low intensity fire, like you're seeing in the top two images and the bottom left, that there's not very much risk. Based on the literature and my experience as well, the risk really comes in when you're using low intensity fire, when you have woody debris that is catching fire near the bole of a tree and then holds fire there, such that it reaches that critical temperature to damage the tree. So that's really where the problem comes in, especially if you're using some of these practices that might generate some of this downed woody debris. So I wanted to quantify that based on the literature, and I looked at a variety of papers to do that, and I settled in. I wanted to focus on this Mann et al. Because it was recent. It also has a lot of stands across the Appalachians and Central Hardwoods regions. You can see there's 4 areas, and they also their compartment size for the stands they were managing are pretty similar to what I typically am seeing from private landowners and on many management areas as well. So in this study, they tracked how fire affected the quality and in terms of volume, but also value of these stands following up to 6 fires. So really great study. Also, I reviewed the ones listed below, and frankly, they all give pretty similar results. So I'm focusing on Mann for the purposes of quantifying the risk. So on the right side now, you can see data from that paper, and they have it parsed out based on the red is south-facing slopes and the blue is north-facing slopes. So you can see they were interested in how that affected fire intensity. The x-axis is the number of prescribed fires. You can see when you get up to more than 4 or more fires, the risk to volume, so how much you lose in that stand over long term at harvest, was somewhere around 8%. All right, so the value though was a little bit higher than that. That was about 12%. So on average across all those stands, they were losing about 12% of the relative value in that. However, before you take that to heart, we need to talk about some other things that I'm going to go over in more detail. One, they grouped species, and basically the white oak species are red here, and then the other tree species that were merchantable are in blue. And this is basically telling you that for the upland hardwoods that are fire adapted, like the white oaks, the volume loss, and this is from the butt log, was substantially lower as you added fire compared to the other tree species. Okay. So another thing that I wanted to point out here that is particularly important is Mark Twain noticed the relative volume loss or value loss was substantially higher in those stands than all of the others. Look at that. It's 5 times more loss than the next closest one. And I wanted to dig into that. Why is that? So when I looked into the paper, I realized why that was occurring. At Mark Twain, they were using fire intentionally at high intensity with the intent of killing overstory trees to restore it back into woodlands. So this is generally not the kind of fire that we're trying to use, especially if you have an interest in timber value. And that did skew the value loss substantially. If you look at all of these studies together, we average about 3% loss across the board. And that's after repeated fires over the long term. So I wanted to kind of give a worst case scenario for y'all to think about this. And based on the value of timber at the time of this paper, I calculated and you know, if we had 4 stands and let's say fire got away from us and 1 out of every 4 burns, that would kind of represent what we saw in the Man et al. Paper. Remember, they had 4 sites. So 3 of them, they're maintaining relatively low loss, 1 site relatively high loss. So I just thought, okay, if we're trying to use low intensity fire, but every once in a while one gets away from us, that's how I calculated this worst case scenario. In that worst case scenario, if we're realizing about 10% damage, that equates to about $83 per acre over the life of that stand when we get to harvest. That's also for a fully stocked stand. Remember, we need to release sunlight. So in many cases, we would go in and remove some of those trees before we were using fire anyway. So keep that in mind. I also found it pretty interesting, the closest site to where you all are, they had very little damage, and that was actually consistent with a couple of the other studies where the value loss is actually down in the around 1%. So not much damage at all. So when we're going through these calculations, you remember the paper I showed you from the Tennessee study, that releases about 650 pounds of forage based on the data we collected there. That is about 16% protein. I wanted to quantify the cost per pound of protein you gain based on that practice, assuming that we even contract the burning, all right? And then project that over a 10-year time period. And then I wanted to compare it to other things that people, especially private landowners, regularly do without even thinking about it. So that was providing protein through a food plot or supplemental feeding. And you're seeing the comparison of those costs. This is assuming, so the first line under the 10-year management plan is assuming that you get 650 pounds of additional forage and times 16% crude protein, and you're contracting all of the burning at $30 per acre. And you're repeatedly burning on a 3-year interval for that 10 years. So that works out to about 9 cents per pound. That's not even counting all of the other benefits we've talked about, like nesting and fawning cover. This is just based on food availability. And if you compare that to a cowpea food plot, you can see it's already less than what people would spend by planting cowpea food plots year after year. So that to me was pretty interesting. In my part of the world, especially, supplemental feeding is really common across the landscape for deer, and that works out to about $2.50 per pound. Notice in the parentheses, I have that 4 cents per pound. That's if you went in and removed half of the timber through a shelterwood harvest before you started this burning management. So you can see in a stand that you've reduced the canopy in, the cost per pound of forage gained would be even better relative to these other practices. So to close and kind of summarize that, basically, if you consider the losses based on this worst case scenario in this long-term study, it still costs you 27 times more to provide protein to deer through other, the supplemental feeding practice. That's a pretty substantial difference. And to me, that kind of puts it into a context where it has a meaningful, I guess a meaningful context to people that have a barrier that they're going to damage timber. So even in the case that that's true, it's still potentially more valuable to you to do that and more cost effective for you to do that than to manage for some of the same things through other practices. So if you're not aware, I have a lot of things that I make available to people to generate information that are available to you. I host the Wild Turkey Science podcast, also Fire University podcast, and the Natural Resource Universities podcast. Also, very active on social media. We share videos and papers and things like that constantly that are related to this topic. So if you're interested, I'd encourage you to apply, and I'd be really happy to take any questions if anybody has one.
Good. We got one here, Marcus. We're just getting a microphone to him.
Well, can you offer any advice to us here in Pennsylvania? Because it seems like we run relatively low frequency just due to acid. What advice can you give us maybe best habitat given acid that we're at?
I did not hear the question. I could hear someone talking, but I have no idea what was said.
Well, we're looking for advice on how to best improve our habitat here in Pennsylvania, given that we're not able to run as high a fire frequency currently as what a lot of the southern states are running. Do you have any advice? Is it more light, trying to get more fire frequency on the ground, oversize where we're at? What do you think is going to give us the biggest habitat bang for our habitat?
Can you repeat that into this microphone? Because I can't hear that microphone at all. Yeah, you could just summarize. I caught a little bit of it that time, but yeah.
So basically, what would give us the most bang for a buck here compared to where you guys are there in your information on whether it's frequency, return interval, or what would your recommendations for our area be? That's close, Travis.
In terms of fire return interval, is that okay? Generally, based on my experience seeing vegetation responses, comparing in the deeper south to more northern latitudes, when you're holding other things constant like sunlight and soil productivity, generally the desirable fire return interval for the same objective is a couple of years longer. So where I might recommend to generate really high quality brooding cover, for example, in the south, I might give a 2-year return interval very commonly, sometimes more frequently in very high productivity systems, sometimes less frequently in low productivity systems. But 2 would probably be the average if I'm trying to achieve that objective. And in Pennsylvania, I would be more in the 3 or 4 year range for that same objective. And you're very commonly in the first year, if it's a dormant season fire in particular, the first year you'll have pretty decent brooding cover. In the second year, you will have very good brooding cover. Whereas in the south, that second year is kind of getting on the fringe in many systems. The same would apply if we were talking about fawning cover for deer. I may give a recommendation here of a 3 to 5 year return interval, whereas in your neck of the woods, I'd be more likely to say 5 to 7 or even more in a low productivity site. Does that sufficiently answer the question, or are there other aspects of it?
Yeah, Marcus, that was answered Travis's question. Thank you. Any other questions while we have Marcus? Okay, we want to give Well, we got one more. Hang on. We got a couple. Go ahead, Eric.
Question that every guy wants to know, Marcus, size matter.
Does size matter?
Like size of burn was.
Size of the burn unit?
Yes.
Absolutely. Yes. Would you like me to expand on how? Yeah, I mean, the size of the units absolutely matter, and in particular, I like to give reference to species, and I usually give deer and turkeys because that's what most private landowners that I work with care about. For a turkey that has, a hen turkey that is brooding, and she needs nesting cover to essentially be directly adjacent to brooding cover to have a very high success. And you can imagine if you're in a situation where you're burning 200 or 300 acres and it's very ubiquitous, those two things may not occur in the same stand, and she might have to walk quite a ways to get from one to the other. And in that scenario, the burn units are too large to maximize their benefit for that objective. So I'm happy to provide a link to a paper. I've reviewed the literature on this topic and tried to find as much information and relate it to several wildlife species. I'm happy to share that. But to be frank about it, we don't have that much experimental literature on burn size to expand that on how it affects different objectives. But based on the habitat use requirements, especially for species that are less mobile, it seems to be very important. But we really need to do more work in that area, and I have worked on it quite a bit, and I still think that's one of our frontiers in fire ecology and fire management to deal with, is how does size matter and how does that vary based on the species that you're trying to benefit. So the take-home message, well, a couple of take-home messages. One, one of the experiments that I did, I was just looking to see how small of an acreage could we get to and still see the magnet effect that I mentioned in the presentation. And for deer, we got down to 1/4 acre burn units, and they still responded to that just the same as they did if it was a 25 acre burn unit. So that tells me that, at least that attraction, is pretty strong regardless of the scale, but the access to it might vary substantially. So the other take home message, I think, is if you have competing objectives and you have for example, wide range of species that you're trying to meet habitat requirements for, the best thing to do is vary the burn unit size. And I think for most species, when you start getting up over 50, maybe 100 acres, you're starting to get fairly large for what they are going to use it for in terms of their habitat demands.
Okay, thank you, Marcus. I think we have one more question over here. There's Mike. Is it on?
We may have a question in the Q&A as well. Yep, we have one.
Marcus, I'm new to the community, so a lot of people live about that. Most of what I hear about prescribed burns are really benefit wildlife. But is there any benefit in an agricultural context, like for pasture land or even upland or something like that?
Can you repeat that one? I didn't get it.
Yeah, so his question was, any benefits to prescribed fire in agricultural setting for croplands or pasture lands or anything like that?
Well, from a wildlife habitat standpoint, I would say that they're in the area that's being used for production is probably not a great value. It may release resources like seeds that are exposed seeds or insects, but in in that system, when you have things like field borders or feathered edges on the edge of agriculture, you know, the fire in that circumstance can have great value. And I've seen it used very well for a number of species in many contexts where you have semi-native plant communities that are associated with the agricultural landscape, and you can have a substantial impact on habitat quality by using fire basically directly adjacent to the ag. There's also a question online on the written in. Do you want me to address that?
Yeah, so I'll read it for everybody. It says, any advice on dealing with woody debris post timber harvest when you're looking to preserve marketable timber value? Is there a time of year that is best to introduce fire to a stand with lots of slash?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I have seen landowners, private landowners, deal with this in various ways, you know, that where they have generally smaller acreage that they can address this with, and they're really keen to do so on their land. And we have taken a couple of approaches, and I've worked with several landowners that have done things like this. Some people will literally go in and rake around prized trees. Maybe you have an oak that is exceptional producer, and they literally will go in and do things like that at an individual stand level. Also, for some of the work that we did in Tennessee, I was a graduate student, and another graduate student had a small chainsaw and a couple of other tools, and we would go in to prep the stand, you know, in a 15 or 20 acre stand in those forest stand improvement units where we have a lot of dead trees that have fallen and limbs that were around it. And basically, you know, for about it took us about an hour and a half or two to prep before the burn, which you could do a week in advance if you so desired, and just make sure that our prized trees in the overstory that we want to ensure don't get damaged. We would just remove that woody debris around it. That may not be practical in all circumstances. I realize that if you're burning a large amount of acreage, that may not be something that you can do. And in that case, generally, I would recommend that you start burning in the dormant season, and under conditions, I guess, where some of the large fuels have relatively high moisture is better. I realize in hardwood systems that may be a little more difficult than it is in pine, but taking precautions to ensure that your fire behavior can be maintained at low intensity, and that interacting with heavy fuels that have relatively high moisture will help you to deal with that issue, if you can't do those other things as well.